Hey, everybody, what's up? Welcome to another episode of the Chase Jarvis Live Show here on Creative Live. You know the show. This is where I sit down with amazing humans, and today's guest is one of those amazing humans. This bio is heavy, so get ready. She's a writer, she's a renowned speaker, public servant, Pulitzer Prize winner, among so many things. So again, hold on to your headphones for this bio. And know that we talk about some huge stuff in this episode, like using creativity to solve the world's biggest problems, like storytelling and what a critical skill is in almost any job in the world, why art and our humanity are among the biggest means for connection. That's right, I am talking about Ambassador Samantha Power. Ambassador Power began her career as a journalist, reporting from places like Bosnia, East Timor, Kosovo, Rwanda, Sudan, Zimbabwe. She was the founding executive director of the Carr Center for Human Rights at the Kennedy School. Then she became a distinguished professor of practice at the Harvard Law School. And from 2013 to 2017, she served as the U.S. ambassador to the UN and a member of President Obama's cabinet. She served on the National Security Council as a special assistant to the president. And she, who wrote her first book, again, which won a Pulitzer. She also has several others. Most recent one just came out this week in paperback called Education of an Idealist. And it was recently named one of the best books of 2019 by the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Economist, Vanity Fair, NPR, Time, and others. And she's about to go before the Senate to get confirmed to run now the largest aid agency in the world. President Biden said when announcing her for the new critical role, she's a leading voice for humane and principled engagement in the world. She will rally the international community and work with our partners to confront the biggest challenges of our time. And I'm telling you, you are in for a treat. So I'm going to get out of the way. And please welcome to the show, Ambassador Samantha Power. Ambassador Power, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here today.
Very grateful to be here.
For the first of all, folks who might not be familiar with your work, as I mentioned in our little gathering before the show, the audience of our show is largely creators and entrepreneurs, people who identify with trying to develop, take inspiration from a wide swath of folks. Part of my job as the host of the show is to curate a really diverse set of voices. And yours is a voice that has so much experience and is slightly different than most of the guests, the entrepreneurs say that we have on the show, although you are very entrepreneurial in your own way. You've been an ambassador and you started off as a journalist. And so for people who are not familiar with your work, if you could help us just, ground us in time and space with your personal experience and maybe intro how you got to where you are today.
Okay, great. Thank you. Well, first, I should say that I'm an immigrant to America from Ireland. I came when I was 9 years old, not by myself. My mother came wanting, there was no divorce in Ireland back then. The Catholic Church was very influential, and my mother and my father, unfortunately, were splitting up. So my mother came with my younger brother and me, with a fellow Irish doctor who she would go on to marry later when she'd been in this country long enough. And we lived in Pittsburgh. And then I went to high school in Atlanta, Georgia. I was into sports like that. If you heard my name in my school or in any of the environments I found myself in, I was either playing sports or talking about sports. And I was apolitical. Again, as newcomers to this country, I wouldn't have known the difference between a Democrat or a Republican. And I probably, because I was Irish, I think Irish kids have a decent grasp of geography in their DNA, because I think there's some sense in the bloodstream that you might have to leave someday, dating many centuries back. So, even though I was a decent student, but even though my focus was on sport, I would have had some sense that there were things happening out in the world, particularly back in my home country of Ireland, where my family still were. And but if you'd asked me in college what I would go on to do, I'd say, well, I've failed to become an Olympiad or a professional athlete, so I guess I'm going to be a sportscaster. And the summer after my first year at Yale, I was interning in the sports department of the CBS affiliate in Atlanta, Georgia, where I'd gone to high school. And I was taking notes on what I thought was the most important thing in the world that day, which was an Atlanta Braves game. And as I was taking notes in order to cut the sports highlight for the evening news, the footage from Tiananmen Square was beamed in on the CBS news feed, which I would not, again, as a matter of course, have been watching, but for the serendipity of having to cut the sports highlights. And what I saw in that footage was kids my age. It was after my freshman year. I was 18 years old. Getting mowed over by tanks, kids who'd been protesting for weeks and actually been allowed to protest prior to that point, kids jumping onto their bicycles and draping the wounded over the handlebars and so forth. It was just an arresting set of images, and it wasn't a movie. It was real. And it didn't make me say, one day I'm going to be UN ambassador and I'm going to be standing up for human rights. I mean, that would have been like saying one day I'm going to live on Mars. I mean, it was so far from my life's experience, so far from where I would have had even a thimble's worth of confidence to be able to think about going. But it is a, I can kind of feel it viscerally even to this day, which gives you a sense of what it even meant at the time. Sometimes we go back and we find out of the haze of the highlight reel, these events, and maybe superimpose a meaning onto them. But I definitely talked to friends at the time and said, this is galvanizing. I have to know more about what's going on in the world. I went back to college, became a much more serious student. I still had a sports show with a group of guys at night where we sounded off with big opinions, sort of a precursor to talk radio, I'm embarrassed to say, not of the podcast vintage or depth. But after college, I was by then much more informed about events in the world. The Cold War had ended. I graduated in 1992. The Persian Gulf War had occurred, and these big coalition had been mobilized to get Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait. And it felt like the rules of the road might actually exist, that human rights might actually be enforced and promoted. And then there was this conflict in the former Yugoslavia that was kind of cutting in the opposite direction, where people were being ethnically cleansed, and it was heartbreaking. And but also just, again, kind of seemingly counter historical, like it was like a relic, it seemed. Now, little did I know then that in some ways it's a preview for some of the sectarianism and extremism and tribalism that we see even plaguing our own society. At the time, it felt like a last gasp of a group of people who hadn't gotten the memo that things were about to get better and that liberalism was going to prevail worldwide and all of that. But because I had been a sports reporter and I'd covered the college volleyball team and basketball team, and because I had no other skills to actually be able to help anybody, but because I was now open, my innards were kind of open to taking in what was happening there. I looked to find a way to make a difference, because it was, I mean, this was refugees. 1 in 2 people in Bosnia were displaced and sent into Europe. And again, we'd had such high hopes for what Europe would become after the Cold War ended. And so, unable to work for a humanitarian aid agency or really do anything that felt tangible to be of use, I thought to myself, well, I can write a lead, I can write 500 words or 800 words, and maybe what I really need to do is get a deeper education about what could make people turn on each other like this. And with that, I got an agreement from U.S. News and World Report, one of the glossy magazines with Time and Newsweek at the time, to just take my what were called collect calls. You remember collect calls? To be
Oh
able to
yeah.
reverse charges. That was like a big deal in those days. So to get an editor to agree, yes, we'll take your collect call. You can bill us. That was like hitting the jackpot. So I went over, and I had never really reported on anything other than basketball, baseball, volleyball, crazy. But the community of people who were there were young people like me who were equally horrified, and they took me under their wing and kind of taught me the ways of the road. Let me be in their armored cars because I had no resources, because I was just a freelancer, and it really educated me. So that was the beginning of what I call the education of an idealist, I guess. But just learning the trade craft of how to be a war correspondent, I couldn't have learned that on my own. And it's as you know, journalism has a reputation for being so cutthroat, and that people would be sort of kissing up or and kicking down. And it wasn't like it was amazing. It was mainly women, actually young women who had gone and were similarly freelancers, but they were further along in their evolution. So that was where I cut my teeth. I was there for 2.5 years. I learned about what can cause ethnic conflict. I learned about the UN and the limits of its response. I learned about the solidarity of working in a community, which I had never experienced before. It was a lot like a team sport in some ways, which is not what journalism is often accused of being. But I also, I guess, experienced the sort of hollow sense that you have when you write something that is searing and you feel it's kind of landing on deaf ears. And so I suppose if Tiananmen and seeing those images from June of 1989 in Beijing was like a first inflection point, a second was actually succeeding in becoming someone who wrote for the Washington Post and the Economist, and I had, this amazing set of relationships and ended up on the front page, and yet having a sense that the people in Washington who were reading these stories, they may very well have been moved. I may very well even have succeeded from a literary sense of bridging these distances, but the the reporting I was doing was grimmer every day. The war was just getting worse for the people that I was coming to care an awful lot about, because they were my neighbors and my friends. And so I left Bosnia before the war ended, just before, and went to law school, which go figure. But I had some vague idea that I would go like hunt down the bad guys, and the Hague, the War Crimes Tribunal had just been set up, and I could be a prosecutor. But instead, when I was in law school, I wrote a paper for a class on American responses to genocide in the 20th century. 20-page paper that became a 50-page paper that became an 80-page paper that eventually 5 years later became a book. And one senator named Barack Obama, who had just been elected in 2006. Is that right? No, sorry, 2004. He was elected and took office into early 2005. He read the book and he's like, "All right, wise gal, you got all these big ideas. I'm new to Washington. I care a lot about thinking differently about foreign policy. Come join me and let's figure some of this stuff out together." And so that was a major change in my life's journey, and brought me to Washington, and ultimately culminated in me being U.S. ambassador to the UN. That was a long account
This,
of
but this,
a winding road. I apologize.
no, just please, Smith, this is why people tune in, because they don't want the short version. They want the long version. And you're I mean, to be fair, you just sort of, I guess, traversed like 25 years, right? So that you did a great job. But there's so much to unpack there for our listeners and watchers. And a couple of places I'd like to cut in, if I may. And one of them starts with, you talked about being an outsider early on, when you first went there and didn't know the craft, and you had just enough. It sounds like from your sports journalism, you had just enough to be dangerous and not enough to do the job, to excel at the job, and to say, I think your words were, felt like an outsider or new to the role or whatever. I was hoping you could, because there's so many people who are watching and listening, that they're moving into a new area of life where they are an outsider, or there's imposter syndrome, or they need to seek mentorship or guidance or be a part of a community. What role? I just sort of triangulate a couple things like mentorship, imposter syndrome, feeling like an outsider. What role did that play in shaping who you are? And if you could give any advice on how you, like, tactically, how did you start to, I don't know if the right word is assimilate, or join that community and learn and grow in your craft?
Maybe I'll go back in time just to when I came to America, and I hadn't even thought of the analogy until you posed the question in the way that you have. But when I moved to America as a kid, I noticed that everyone around me was talking about baseball. I had moved to Pittsburgh. The Pirates were winning the World Series. The Steelers were about to win the Super Bowl. And I think just reflexively as a kid, you're like, okay, what's the currency? This is the currency. And and so if I flash forward to being in Bosnia, I think that I felt completely like an outsider. I mean, from the basics of being asked by National Public Radio not long after I arrived to do a spot and saying, yes, absolutely, I'll call you back in a few minutes and I'll do the spot, hanging up and saying to my closest friend there at the time, Laura, what's a spot? Spot as it has actually a regular English language meaning, and so I know what a spot is, but what's this kind of spot? And what is the arc of it? And then being so embarrassed to like try it out in front of her, and afraid that I'd be shunned or that I'd be outed. That's how we mainly feel when we're new to something and not at all confident. And but what I thought to myself is, what can I bring? I mean, what do I know that these people don't know? These people have been covering this war. Maybe they started covering the Croatian War and they've been in Bosnia from the beginning. I was a year, came like 15 months into the Bosnian War. And you can imagine you're sitting around late at night and they're drinking their whiskey and you're drinking yours, and you feel like they deserve their whiskey. Like they've been here for 15 months living under siege in Sarajevo. They're now out, let's say, in a more peaceful part of the region and entitled to their drink. What the hell have I done? And one of the things I noticed was that most of them were very dependent on interpreters, local interpreters who became their close friends. These were more like partnerships. But before coming, I had started to seek to learn at least Serbo-Croatian. I don't have a gift for languages, but I do have a gift for stubbornness. So I was like, all right, I'm going to be the person who they don't have to pay. Who's going to be the colleague who's never going to be great. It's never going to be, TV interview quality translation, but maybe if I study my flashcards long enough, if I nerd out on this language, I can get by. And I can thus, when we're on the road and we have a flat tire, God forbid, in a war zone, I can be the person engaging about how to get the flat tire fixed, or I can get through an interview depending on the level of education of the person I might be speaking with. And so I dug into that, and I dug into history. And this is more a kind of rational answer than a spiritual one, I suppose, but it really was about, how can I feel like I'm not just a hanger on or a freeloader for people who know what they're doing? Because I knew I was there not only taking notes on my interviews, but taking notes on the way others were taking notes. In other words, I knew what I didn't know. And I do think that has been a strength. That's a weird strength, I suppose. But I am always acutely aware, at least of the outer bounds of the limits of what I know. And so that sort of not being afraid to ask questions or to appear, there's a vulnerability in asking questions. There's a vulnerability in admitting the novelty of something and not kind of faking experience. And I made myself very vulnerable in those days, but at the same time, I worked at trying to be in a position to offer something. And I think in a way, my friends from that time would just say, you didn't need to offer anything. You were just one of us. Like we had started 15 months before and been equally clueless. We didn't need you to interpret, but it's all psychological. In my own head, I just felt so much better when I felt like I was giving something back to this community.
Uh, I I love that answer, not only because it plays into a personal belief of mine, but because it is heartfelt and earnest and vulnerable. But there's some really, I think, some precise language that I want to try and attach to it. First of all, you said earlier, this is in a way the education of an idealist. And again, for those new to you and your work, I want to say congratulations on your book. titled said earlier phrase, The Education of an Idealist. Your memoir, which was a New York Times bestseller, just come out in paperback. So congratulations. And for those folks who are new to your work, I cannot recommend it enough. Page turner, and so much history and self-reflection and humanity. It's incredible. So first of all, congratulations. But if we think about this, what I hear in your voice is this idealism. I can go there. What I'm hearing also is deconstructing the world around you. And this idea of, I think of it in two steps, and I want to share this and then have you reflect and see if I'm off on the mark or off the mark and what you would editorialize. So in deconstructing what you said is the currency of others, there's almost a humility and a respect for those who'd come before you, the work that they'd done. But it seemed like you did that as a way to connect and be a part of something. But there's some switch in there that you flipped, and you started to do your own thing. You started to have a sense of confidence, or I'm curious. This is where I want you to pick up my
Mhm.
narrative here and say, what was it? Because there's the humility to fit in, and then there's also has to be some sort of desire to stand out, and you can't do those things at the same time. You did one first. Where did that come from? And if you think of who we're talking to today, the community that listens to this, like that is a really important sort of skill or self-awareness. And it's seemingly in the story that you just tell, it was intuitive to you. So pick up where and again, or throw rocks at this concept that I'm introducing here. But
Well, I think so. I've become familiar in later years with the idea of being, and the expression I keep hearing is mission driven, right? Mission driven. And that can mean a whole host of things, and it can be a blinding way to live in the world in insofar as you can lose perspective. And indeed, if I think of myself in my early 20s, maybe with a sizable dose of sanctimony about what so and so in Washington should do about this or that or the other thing. I may have been in the mission driven to a fault kind of category, but I was very actually motivated by. I mean, it just sounds again sort of cheesy, if nothing else, but just it was so horrible what was happening uh, in this place at that time. In some ways, it's a reflection of the kind of relatively privileged life that I had led. Being from Ireland, coming to America, being embraced ultimately, by my classmates, having these educational opportunities. But to go from being a Yale college student to being in Sarajevo, as people are just being targeted because of their ethnicity, that wasn't supposed to be happening anymore in Europe, right? Like we'd all read Elie Wiesel and we'd read about Anne Frank and we'd pledged never again in our political culture and our popular culture. Schindler's List had just come out the year that I would end up moving to Bosnia. And I'm mentioning this, which is a little bit of a tangent from your question, because I do think it rendered less salient for me the question of am I standing out? And it and by the way, I'm not sure my colleagues would even agree with what I'm saying here, because it rendered way more salient for me, am I writing for publications that are going to be read by people who can make a difference in the lives of people here? And that's so if presumptuous for sure, pompous potentially as well. But I was literally like, this was, the internet was there, but it wasn't the same today. Where like today I could write for the Boston Globe and I could just know, that if I broke a story and uncovered a mass grave, or if I wrote a very compelling, it would sort of circulate in the corridors of power. Maybe you can assume that today. I think you can. But then it was much more siloed, the media environment. And so I wanted to be a freelancer for the Washington Post. I wanted to, when I saw, kids who were jumping rope in a playground and picked off by snipers or by shellfire, and I wrote that story and wrote about the impotence of the UN peacekeepers who were there or the policymakers behind them. I really wanted President Clinton to be reading that article. And that was a little weird, right? That was not all that. I mean, others were very moved and had come to the former Yugoslavia because of they was sort of like the Spanish Civil War back in the day. It had that same kind of magnetic pull on people who wanted to tell the stories of people who were voiceless. But I went that next step of, I wonder if the assistant secretary for Europe is really like that, like, again, nerding out on the other side of it about what was happening back in Washington. And so why is that an answer to your prior question? Because I have found over my career, and I'm thinking about this now as I contemplate, a new job of even greater ambition, arguably, than anything I've ever done in terms of ambition for impact in the world. And I have a set of hiring decisions that will be before me soon. And I've just learned that those people that can articulate the mission that moves them most, the hunger they have to acquire the skills, for lack of a better word, to figure shit out, to be able to get things done on behalf of what gets them out of bed in the morning, that is the most adaptive professional qualification that I can find, or it's at least the chapeau under which a lot of those other kind of skills can fall, or it's what motivates, again, the acquisition of those skills. So I think that my drive, which to others might have just looked like she wants to be in the Washington Post, she's not only is she one of us, now she's insisting on sucking up to get that freelance arrangement, or whatever, however it might have looked. When I look back at myself, it was so kind of innocent and clueless in its way, in believing that if as if President Clinton didn't have access to all the most important information in the world already. I mean, it was delusional, that if I only wrote that story in that way, that could kind of change the calculus. So, but I do mention it because, boy, if you come, and I say this to young people because now I'm back on a campus and in a classroom, if you go from, instead of, I believe in social justice, or I want to promote human rights, or I, want to deal with systemic racism, and can drill into that and be really specific about your slice of that, I do find that ends up being a recipe for, just instrumentalizing those skills, where you're just like, okay, I need to learn how to fundraise now. Damn it. That book that would have seemed really boring if I would have ordered it from Amazon no matter what. But, I got my Twitter account, I got the phone, I got my kids, I got, like, many things are going to keep me away from reading that book. But if I have a mission to raise money around Black Lives Matter in this moment, or, to deal with the migration or displacement crisis at the southern border in this moment, my motivation, the stickiness, right, of a mission, where you then attach the skills that you just need on the, but you're almost mindless about acquiring them because it's so driven by what's motivating you in the first place.
That is so well articulated, and it mirrors an experience that I had in my first time I really felt like I wanted to learn something. There's school, and there's getting a good or passing grade, and the things that others want you to do. And then there was my desire to, say, learn how to be a photographer, how to tell stories. And it was a moment of, it was an awareness moment for me. Like, not only does this not sound like work, but this is required. This is the thing standing between where I am right now and where I want to be. And, if we go back to the title of your book, The Education of Idealist, I think there's this, that is sort of baked into that thought that you shared, and it is idealism. But yet here you are, not only have you not been in service of that mission, but you, it could be fair to say that you blew that original ambition out of the water. And so, help me synthesize for people at home, like, how important that idealism is, because we're often told to give up on our dreams. And, maybe when you were there in Bosnia, your colleague, instead of telling you what a a spot was could have just rolled their eyes and said, what are you doing? You don't belong on, NPR, or even if they just made a joke and didn't give you the information, or, it's hard to, and this is also from even neutral parties. They might not want you to succeed, but they're like, who are you to fill in the blank? And I believe that that's a huge part of our culture. And we want to surround ourselves with people that lift us up and empower us and engage us. And even if those people aren't there, what can you do for yourself? Acknowledging the privilege part that you said earlier. Like if you're in a community where that's not popular, then you have an extra gravitational pull that you need to escape velocity or whatever. But speaking very specifically, you are an idealist, and yet you've been able to accomplish so many of the things, maybe even outperform your own idealism, given the role that you're stepping into. We can get into that in a little bit, but what advice would you give to others that might feel disproportionately that gravitational pull, that sort of media, this like the mediocrity that, for better or I would argue for worse, is pervasive in our culture? You escaped that. You remained an idealist. You wrote the book with that title. You clearly living it. What advice would you give to others who are contemplating it but afraid?
Yes, it's a great question. So, first of all, what I would say is that um, my idealism really is not grand, right? Insofar as I think it's a general sense
Working
that the
for the
world.
president.
No, no, no. I'll come to what how
Okay.
all this crazy stuff happened in the end, but it's a pretty simple. Like I think almost irrespective of one's line of work, or even I increasingly see that get with younger and younger people, even high school students and middle schoolers, just a basic sense that the world is not optimized. We're not in. We could do better, right? And then a related sense, and this is where people I think stumble, and I have stumbled through my life, which is, and I can, not even that I can do something about it, but I'm going to try to do something about it. And the it is not saving the whole world; it's some sliver, and like next to the problems of the world, arguably minuscule sliver. And so there are two things in what I'm saying. I mean, it is that sometimes I think that even when you look at the trajectory of the career that I've been fortunate enough to have, if I had set out and said, as I was sort of joking that I never would have in the moment where I first sort of got a little reoriented toward caring about international affairs or human rights back during the Tiananmen time, if I had said to myself, my goal is to become UN ambassador, first of all, therein madness lies. Like anybody who sets their goal around a title or a position, forget about it. I mean, you've increased the utter impossibility. The odds of that ever happening have plummeted. And I have young people come up to me is like, I love your life. It's incredible, and I also want to change the world. How do I become UN ambassador? So one day I'm like, oh no, don't do that. And it's not just don't do that because you sound like an asshole. It's don't do that because then you won't it's what you were talking about. You won't have the stores of experience and, frankly, the ever incrementally expanding skill set to make your difference, right? And so my idealism, again, is more it's sort of at a general level. And had I set my sights on ending the war in Bosnia single-handedly, I probably would be a sportscaster now, right? Because that would have been a crushing defeat. It wouldn't have happened, or I certainly wouldn't have had, as a kid, a huge impact in events there. And so this is the important point: is that I think, and I don't know why I've been instinctively that this has been my approach, but I have always set the immediate goal in a rather modest way. And I have this sort of way I describe it in the book that I it's sort of a term that I've come to use, or a phrase that I've come to use for it, which is the X test, right? Where you're at a crossroads, something in you is, it's like things are a little off. You've either exhausted what you can learn, or you've exhausted what you can contribute, or maybe, somebody's driving you crazy, whatever, something's a little off, or you're seeing something on the horizon, maybe something on the news that you want to do something about. If you set your objective to be fixing that thing that you've seen on the news, it's going to be really hard to take that leap, right? And to just go, and that's just, again, a degree of gumption that most of us do not have, right? That I'm going to leave my job and I'm going to go fix this problem. If by contrast you say, okay, the problem, for example, that animates me a lot is the refugee crisis, the largest displacement around the world than at any point since the Second World War. So I could say, I want, the last administration, let's say, to change its immigration policy, or I want governments around the world to give more money to UNHCR so there'll be more food and shelter and education for these folks. But that said, it's like, am I going to really, as a private citizen now, no longer, am I going to have it within my reach to be able to make that kind of difference? Probably not. And I know that even modest success is fuel. It's fuel for, again, an incrementally enhanced set of objectives. So instead, to simply say, I'm going to adopt one refugee family, and damn it, I'm going to help those kids get through high school, and I'm going to make sure that they see a friendly and a welcoming side of America. And so the X test for me is when you're at a crossroads, to say to oneself, if all I get out of doing this next thing is X, will it have been worth it? And so in the refugee context, if all I do is help 3 people Syrians who've come to America in this horribly inhospitable time, well, damn, that'd be a good way to spend a year or a week or a life, frankly, to help 3 people. And so even then, I was in government, I was in the cabinet of the President of the United States. That still ends up being a really useful way of embarking on risk, because it's kind of self-protective. It acknowledges one's own kind of fear of those big gaps between one's goals and one's, what one delivers. You can build teams more easily around it. You can kind of meet people where they are, where they're thinking, oh, Samantha's got some crazy idea again about how we're going to fix this or that. No, it's just say, hey team, if all we do is this. We launched, when I was UN ambassador, a campaign to free 20 female political prisoners around the world. And when you think about America, the superpower, the idea that our campaign would be just that, it's so small, it's so modest. And yet, oh my God, the young foreign service officers and the civil service officers, when the first woman got out of jail and was reunited with her family, I mean, you would have thought we'd, resolved every conflict on planet Earth for the morale boost. And yet when I set out to launch that campaign, I didn't say to them, we're going to get these women out of jail. Even that seemed too ambitious. What I said is, think of how their families will feel if they know that the United States is standing with their wife or mother or daughter, and just the signal that would send, that show of solidarity. Think of the ways in which we can use these single cases to expose systemic injustice where there's been impunity, and that's a good in its own right. So the idealism is there, and the kind of grand ambition is out there. Yes, I want to change the world, but I know that world changing happens in the tiniest bites, just as a practical matter, but also that to attach yourself to something small that is actually within your grasp and that can be achieved can end up kind of weirdly, counterintuitively, being more motivational, more easy to get people past that precipice where they're thinking, I want to try to make a difference, but I don't really think I can. I'm not one of those people. I'm not a self-described idealist. I'm just a person, right? And you say, well, no, let's not define idealism in this, galaxy-altering way. Let's define it as, is there anything out there you'd like to see different? Is there some slice of it that together we could make a dent in? let's see if we can articulate that.
That there, I'm going to try and put that into one phrase that I've used in the show, and that's that you don't actually have to understand and know the whole staircase. You just have to take the first step, and the first step reveals the second or the third, and it's your narrative around that is so powerful because it's actionable. There's so many people who are listening right now who would be paralyzed by the thought of trying to end the conflict in Bosnia or land on the moon if you're, or Mars if you're Elon Musk, or um, I remember, so Cory Booker is a friend who's been on the show before, and Senator Booker at the time was the mayor of Newark, New Jersey, and he talked about fixing potholes, and you could at
Right.
him on Twitter. If you'd see a pothole, you'd take a picture of it and he would say on it. And how that small, incredibly tangible act of repairing potholes, that citizens, individual citizens, would reach out to their mayor, and he'd put in place the mechanism to repair those in like 24 hours. How powerful that was. You talked about galvanizing others, building teams. And I'm wondering if that has that been this fix or help three families, has that been uh, a part of your journey in all of these different disciplines? Because right now we're talking about the crisis in Bosnia, help one Bosnian family, and then you're seeing women being released from prison, etc. Have you applied that to other areas? This just see the first step, and then suddenly you find yourself in the president's cabinet. Is this a known function?
Well,
Uh,
let me
Intentional?
describe it. Let me answer in an immensely parochial and self-involved way, which is so. And again, this is the answer to the people who want to leap um, from A to Z, right? Without,
Mhm.
or like from the bottom of the staircase to the top of the staircase, to take your metaphor. But every career crossroads that I've been at, I think that I made the sort of on paper kind of wrong decision insofar as if my goal had been to become UN ambassador, I did the thing that would seemingly have taken me. That wasn't my goal. I would have never dared to even think of that. But I mean, just again, taking the top of the staircase and making it sort of titular or positional in that way. So, you know, graduated from college and had a lot of opportunities back in the day, and decided I'm going to go be a freelance war correspondent because I have such vast experience covering the basketball and volleyball teams. I'm gonna go make it as a war correspondent. Then I actually get the string after 2 years writing for the Economist and the Washington Post, which would have been, as a somebody who'd become a bit of a foreign policy nerd, just so thrilling to me. And I'm there and it's working, and I have a chance potentially to go back and work for these publications and become a full-fledged foreign correspondent, not a freelancer. I'm like, no, no, I'm going to go to law school. And then I'm in law school and I end up, through serendipity mainly, but partnering with somebody, and we set up a human rights center together. I end up getting to teach at Harvard's Kennedy School, which is all these young public servants, an incredible sort of idealistic culture, but also through teaching, you learn so much yourself. I have health insurance. My mother's over the moon. Finally, I have health insurance. And then I meet this first term senator named Barack Obama. And yeah, you could say, okay, that was a good career move, Samantha, but he didn't have a job to offer me. He didn't have anything. He was building out his staff and he'd already filled the key jobs. And I said, well, why don't I come and affect my book had come out and the book had done well and been read by a lot of people. And, I could have been all, haughty and said, I need this and I need it, but like, I wasn't going to do that. I said to myself, what's the worst thing that can happen if I go down and work with him in his Senate office? Um, the X test, right? If all I get out of this is I learn about the role that the Congress can play as a check and balance on the executive branch and what it does in foreign policy. I mean, this is my career, so I'm learning more and more about foreign policy as I grow. And if all I do is get an up close understanding of the limits of congressional oversight and the possibilities, irrespective of what Barack Obama does with his time or his life, like that's better than going to graduate school and learning that. And lo and behold, it is Barack Obama. I could learn about how to be a better public speaker at the bare minimum. So I'm like itemizing these tiny, people are thinking, you're going to go work for the future of the Democratic Party. He's going to be president one day. And I'm like, I think I can learn to be a better public speaker. Like, in other words, to just define it, it's so self-protective. It's kind of ridiculous. And then, of course, he, despite giving me assurances that he has no intention of running for president anytime soon, and what kind of guy would come and be there for 2 years and then run for president, he would end up running for president. And similarly, as I thought about going into government and having been an activist and been a journalist, if all I achieve is be that voice in the room, standing up for people who are not in those meetings in the Situation Room, I can't guarantee they're going to be huge outcomes. I mean, there's a lot of gravity in American foreign policy that cuts in favor of military assistance and, not scrutinizing some of the relationships that we have around the world. And it's hard to elevate sexual violence against women and girls in the halls of power. And I'd written a book on how hard it was. But if all I did was I was in those meetings, raising that voice, that someone out there would know that voice was there, that was a kind of low bar to clear. And so, these things have come along and they look, increasingly grand and, and as if there is a stature associated with them. But at each instance, as I approach this new mission potentially that I will have in this world, I'm trying to think, what's my X test? If all I do is, what will it have been worth it to the institution? Will it have been worth it to the people who are placing faith in me? Will it have been worth it to my family and my kids who are now, it's going to be going back into the 24/7 national security? What kind of better world am I leaving in being a less available mom than I might have been the last 4 years? And so I find it really helpful to just, you kind of define a way, or you can just kind of create a minimalist account of what success can look like, that then gets you up to that second stair. And then you're in, as you say, and you look around and you think, okay, that actually worked. And now look at all these collateral things that never even occurred to me I would get out of this. I'm kind
Yeah,
of
it's hard to.
glossing the hard parts, right? Like, there's a lot of, the other thing about being on the front end is you don't know, you anticipate bad things that may not even happen, and you don't anticipate bad things that do happen, or challenges that do happen. But even that, once you're in it, once you've taken that leap, you're in the scrum, and you learn about yourself. If you're lucky, that you'll either figure it out, or there'll be someone around who has figured it out who can share that with you. And I think that's the other thing, as you get older and more experienced, is it's less that you get a higher opinion of yourself than that you just learn about your own resilience, and also that it isn't just you, right? That you are a part of institutions and communities that are larger than you. And so you don't have to just go into facing a challenge and think, can I do this? You can instead think, you know, can I uh, can I quickly find the people who are mission driven, who will also not rest, until we find at least a pathway to some impact, even if we can't find like a highway to the kind of major impact that we wish we could make.
Yeah, it's like the goal isn't avoiding mistakes, because mistakes are certain. It's really about error recovery and adaptability, and sort
Right.
of you continually are putting yourself in this space over and over. Um, One thing that struck me while you were talking there is the concept of intuition. And I was wondering if you could share with me what role intuition has played in your career arc, um, through the lens of your humanity, through the lens of your career path, through the lens of your professional ambition. Like, what role has, I'm fascinated by this concept, and which is why
Mm.
I want to ask it. It's a regular on the show, but what role has that played for you?
I think every one of those junctures that I've mentioned to you, and now the one I find myself at, I would have referred to it as my gut right?
Hmm.
And I think it's the same thing. Just some kind of, I think I used the word before, magnetic pull in a certain direction. Now, what I will say though is that I think that we can become, that we are the friends of our own pool of intuitions in this way, in that, you know, in the periods where I have made time to read and to connect with other people, my intuitions get a hell of a lot sharper, right? In the
Yeah.
times when I'm doom scrolling, as I might have been for much of the last 4 years, you know, your intuitions can lie a little bit fallow. You know, my intuition evolves um, in a more pointed and directional way when I have when there are a number of inputs. And so, you know, I even as I've thought about the prospect of, you know, if I had the chance to serve again, you know, serve this country, be out there in the world, trying to harness the tools of the U.S. government and promote American values and interests. If I had the chance, how would I weight that decision against the feeling that my kids are just getting used to me being around, and especially with COVID, of course, are more around more than they ever imagined. You know, 11 and 8 year old, and for really for the whole period that I've been not in government, I've been thinking, what will it be like? And I've really tried to stay in the present and just say this great expression: don't borrow trouble from the future, right? And it is trouble, right? Because it's an actual, you can gloss it as best you can, but there are trade-offs involved in all big commitments in our lives. And but the reason I was able to actually, largely with exceptions, but largely heed the don't borrow trouble from the future and don't import a dilemma before it is presented. I mean, you know, somebody different had to win the presidency. That new president had to actually call on me and be interested in me serving. That's two really big ifs. But what I knew about myself was, until the decision was before me, the set of variables and the kind of ecosystem in which I was sort of trying to listen to my gut and trying to find my intuition, you can't make that up, and you can't project what that's going to be in the future. You can't project, you know, what your mother's going to say to you and how it's going to land, and you know, the team of people that you might have the chance to work with, that you might have imagined it be one and it be the other. It could be better, it could be worse. And I think just that it's really hard to maintain that discipline. It's certainly hard to not borrow trouble from the future. That's impossible, you know, for most of us to do. But the discipline of saying, you know, just that intuition is not static. And at the same time, you know, just as we would if we were planting a garden, you know, you want to give it the sunlight, you want to give it the water, you want to give it the care, you want to make sure that you're allowing just a set of, I don't know what the right word is, even, like inputs or set of voices and set of incommensurate kind of considerations to be part of that swirl. And for me, that requires not being on my phone and, you know, kind of allowing your intuition to breathe, but not to think that it all has to be self-generated. And I think that, as I talk to you, is kind of a recurring theme, right? It's that when you're younger, you think everything is going to come from you, that you're just going to look in and you're going to know, you know, that's the man I want to marry and that's the career I'm going to want to pursue. But in fact, if you're just getting lots of exposures, you know, I mean, hopefully not too many in the romantic domain, you know, to find the right guy. But maybe if that's what it takes, that's what it takes too. I mean, for me, that's what it took to, you know, that you kind of ripen, you know, into that knowledge, right? That in the end, when it's the right time to make the decision, if you've created that open space and you know, solicited views, that it all kind of churns inside you, and then lo and behold, you have an intuition about what the right thing is and how to balance things that on a checklist, it's just two in the head. It's
Yeah.
two system two. These are system one decisions, but it takes a discipline to create a space for them to surface, I think.
Yeah, this intuition develops through action, not through just intellect. You don't
Right.
develop your intuition by sitting on the couch. You talked about adventure and going forward and experiencing, connecting with others. I think that is it's sort of like an unsaid in our culture that's part of how you develop your intuition. And people, I just having asked that question to so many. Thank you for your answers. Very thoughtful and inspired.
But do you remember
So
when we were younger, when we were thinking about who our ideal romantic partner would be, right? And it was like these lists, right? Like, I don't think I have the like most amazing marriage to Cass Sunstein, the most amazing, original, credible person. I don't think one thing, maybe sense of humor was on the list, but you know what I mean? It's just,
yeah,
and I think and I'm not saying it's not useful. It's like when you flip a coin
sure.
and say heads is this and tails is that. Sometimes it takes, you flip the coin to know what you actually want, right? To
Right.
know,
You're like,
oh,
I
damn,
said
it's
that, but now I
tails.
don't actually want that.
Yeah, no, oh, it turns out I wanted heads and I wouldn't have known it without flipping the coin. But so too, like making the list, it can have, great collateral benefits, but it just, in the end, is going to have to come from someplace deeper.
Well, I have a couple of a little new ground I'd like to embark on in our conversation, and I think there's a way from you from a child in Dublin to the streets of war-torn Bosnia to the Situation Room. Like to say that is a crazy arc is a radical understatement. The youngest ambassador to the UN. How um, how has your own creativity? This is, we talk a lot about creativity and entrepreneurship and being, utility and how have those characteristics? Because I'm hearing them and everything you're saying is like experimenting and testing and pushing and have how have they contributed to that incredible arc? You're again the youngest ambassador to the UN. How did you how had those characteristics of entrepreneurship, resilience, creativity, how did they come into play during that journey?
Um, so I think that the this sort of conception of mission drivenness, right? Let's call it that.
Okay.
I think has led me, and it sounds kind of again too generic, but it's sort of like depending on what the problem is you're seeking to solve in a moment. My creativity, to the degree that I'm able to bring it to bear, is derivative. Do you know what I mean? So I'll give you an example. My first book, A Problem from Hell, was a long is a long, sadly, but a long book on American responses to genocide. Not something you would expect to be much of a page turner. And I knew I was an okay writer. I'd been a journalist in Bosnia, and I described American response to the Armenian genocide, the Holocaust, Cambodia, etc., Rwanda. And as I wanted to write this book that was kind of on one level a manifesto, but nobody that I know is ever convinced by a manifesto, right? We're convinced by stories and people and connection and bridges being built between experiential difference of giant proportions. And so as I read the book that I was in the probably took me 5 years to write the book, but the early drafts of the book I read, and they were good. They were good, like brisk moving nonfiction. I was like, no, who am I going to reach that isn't already interested in this question, right? And the only reason to write a book like this and spend all this time on it is in the hopes that maybe I can make it more of a thing, that we don't do enough when genocide is perpetrated abroad, and that it's not enough part of our consideration of of how, whether we give assistance to a foreign government, and we move energetically enough to the United Nations when, like in Rwanda, when people were getting murdered at, 800,000 in 100 days, 800,000 people dying. And so it was not that I started with this ability to kind of imagine the story that I wanted to tell. It was that I realized I was ineffective given the objective that I had for the book. And luckily, I've read enough in my life, not as near as much as I wish I had read, but I've been enough of a reader where I know what works, and I can bring a certain distance from my own writing, but also I hope I can retain the ability to bring distance to my diplomacy and the way I function in government. But at this time, it was more just being kind of an outsider to my own enterprise and just saying this isn't really cutting it. So it turns out in every one of the cases, there were these remarkable characters who had tried to stop genocide. From the Armenian genocide and Henry Morgenthau, our ambassador in Constantinople, to Rwanda, Canadian general, in that case, not American, but Canadian on the ground, and people within the State Department. And every one of these cases, there were these incredible characters. And so was I creative to then decide to build this story, a kind of dark story around these unbelievably inspiring tales? I guess that's kind of what it looks like, because it reads now, you really want to know about these people. And then lo and behold, you learn this other thing. And lo and behold, you're mad when you put the book down and you want to do something about it. And so it has had a shockingly galvanizing effect on some. But to me, it was so much about kind of, it's like the currency. It's like, what does this need to be the best and most accessible version of itself? And when I was UN ambassador as well, where creativity comes in negotiations is, I'm sitting with my Russian counterpart, and we're at loggerheads because Vladimir Putin runs Russia. By and large, that would be the main reason we were at loggerheads. I may not have been easy to deal with either, but for different reasons. And we have to find, the only way we're going to get this resolution through the Security Council is if we creatively put our heads together and actually get sort of some textual options out there and throw some spaghetti against the wall, making ourselves vulnerable to one another, in his case, vulnerable to God knows what in his system. But fundamentally, the only way I can be the diplomat that I need to bridge these gaps that are going to prevent potentially millions of Syrians from getting food is I actually have to walk in his shoes. I'm like, damn it, I do not want to walk in the shoes of Vladimir Putin's representative to the United Nations. Damn it. And yet, I have to internalize, at least to the degree that I have what amounts to almost a literary imagination, right, to be able to do. But I have to think about his constraints, and I have to creatively take this imaginative leap, as we do in great theater, is that right, where every character is always right, even the villain, right? That the best theater would create some complexity and some nuance in who the villain is and where they come from. And in this case, he wasn't the villain, but he was the person who was obstructing what I felt we needed to do for, let's say, the population of northern Syria. And so that, again, my mission was to get this resolution negotiated and to get Russian acquiescence, if not support, because they have the veto. My means was on the fly to realize I have to get out of my own shoes and my own skin, and I have to do a better job internalizing what he needs, or we're just going to be speaking at each other. And so I'm just offering these examples because I don't think at any point that I would have self-identified as a creative person. When I was writing a memoir and I was trying to think back to my days in the pub in Ireland, in Dublin, with my dad, and I there are people who in writing memoirs can just they can have shards of memory and then almost extrapolate because they're so creative. Like, I had to go back to the pub. I had to fly to Ireland, look at the pub, remember. And then of course the smells, or listen to music from that time. And then some of it can come back, or go, better yet, for later years, look in my journals, which is a horrifying thing to do. I don't recommend it to anybody. Even those writing memoirs, it's too painful, too terrible. But that, like, I don't have the creativity to just do it on my own. But then when I'm brought sort of into that space, I know enough to know that to bridge those distances, to meet people where they are, you can't just give them what you want to say in the way that you know how to say it. You have to think of things from the standpoint of the rival diplomat, or of the reader, or of the podcast listener, I guess, of just how do you, how do you meet people where they are? And then the creativity can flow because it's so driven by that need that one has to make that connection across great distances often.
Yeah, that is the creativity with the capital C, not the subset of art and design and photography and filmmaking, but creativity with the capital C, where we're constantly co-creating our environment, the world that we live in. And that was a fantastic example. I remember a bit from the book. I pulled a little excerpt here. It's from page 522, if anybody cares. Any book that has 500 pages, it's
Sorry.
good. 522. Um, and you're really invoking the concept of storytelling as a mechanism to put yourself in others' shoes, and to bring a storyteller into the environment that you've, in your world or parlance, in the sort of the diplomatic relationship. And this is a woman named Nadia Murad, and you invited Nadia, a 21-year-old Yazidi woman, to appear before the council. And when she describes how ISIS had executed her mother and 6 of her 9 brothers and then forced her into sexual slavery, her testimony drove home in a very visceral way the savagery that the US led coalition was working to end. So, is this the storytelling component? I mean, we are social animals, right? We are connected, whether we like it or not, by a neurology, history, past, present. And it's just I guess, how do you think actively of storytelling, whatever it seems like to me, whatever line of work you're in, or to change the world or get funding for your startup, or you know the role that storytelling plays, it seems so powerful. I'm wondering if you invoke this consciously, or is this just a subtext in what is obviously a very sophisticated set of tools that you've got to help be successful.
Well, it's probably the biggest or the thickest through line in every part of my life. So in Ireland, being a little girl in the pub and just hearing the stories, the tall tales being told upstairs, with the stench of Guinness around me, and or to try to get a word in edgewise at an Irish dinner table, like, you can't lose the plot, right? You got to have the arc. The characters have to, then to being an actual journalist, and to go from Bosnia, where, as I said earlier in our discussion, just it's just not enough to describe the tragedy that's unfolding in front of you. You have to do it in a way that's really searching out details, like the most precise little detail that is going to travel, that is going to resonate. And that means not only getting caught up in, as it happens in that instance, a conflict zone that you're living in, but staying plugged into who your readers are. And that, there were occasions when I would lose that, right? I'd be so in the place I was in that it would be my editor who would bring me back to earth and just say, you know what people are dealing with here? You know what just happened? Or, and so I think just that's really important to bear in mind, right? I mean, for lack of a better expression, it's like know your audience, but that's too general. It's really keeping current and keeping curious about what's motivating the people that you're trying to reach, which of course with newspapers or magazines is hard because it's a broad group and there's not one gestalt out there. But that was the storytelling I did as a writer. And then I would go on to do longer magazine pieces, for example, about the genocide in Darfur, where, again, trying to find this is such a foreign phenomenon in this desert area in Western Sudan, and these tribal names that people are not going to be familiar with. And so So what are the resonances that one can find? Well, it turns out the film Hotel Rwanda had come out, and it was a big hit, and people cared about what Don Cheadle thought about things, and how were there dimensions of that film? Are there characters and people that I can find in this context that will resonate with what film goers? I mean, I know it sounds crazy. It's like the tail wagging the dog, but just connections that it's such these distances are so vast, and I think we're our own worst enemies if we just think that, again, because something matters to me, that it's necessarily gonna it may matter, but it just may not rise on the mattering map among many other things that matter. And so the question is like, how do you elevate things? And then in the job, as you know, I would do a couple things. I mean, the first was shockingly at the UN as ambassador, I learned, and I knew kind of going in, but it was weird to experience it, that the kind of culture is one where people actually think that by reading prepared talking points about kind of what should be done, that is going to change someone's mind. And it just isn't ever, right? I mean, it just because for me to say you should do this, and then they say you should do this, and then well, where the hell are we? So there, what I would do is really try to track down individuals, and often, and I had a speechwriter who was my partner, Nick Steinberg, in much of this, but often it would entail actually reaching out to like a refugee camp or to the spouse of somebody who'd been disappeared, or where what you're presenting, it's not enough to just tell a story, right? It's if people feel that it's fresh or that it's authentic. And when I traveled to bring into the Security Council this kind of antiseptic chamber, the stories of the people that I'd met, and it doesn't change the world, but it punctures this bubble, which too many of us, depending on the issue, are able to inhabit. But the more important thing, and I hope a legacy uh, sort of step that we took when I was UN ambassador, that I think has lived on, and maybe to a lesser extent, but I think can easily be revived, is forget about me. Why am I the best storyteller? And the example you gave is a vivid testament to this. My job can be to use my platform and my leverage and the tentacles that the United States has with to mix metaphors, the capillaries out in the world to connect with people who should be able to tell their own stories. And so in the Ebola crisis, having a health worker who was on the front lines in Liberia be the one to say to the Security Council, I had to turn away these families today. And when I turn away a family and they're carrying a child who they want to get care here, they're going to, not only is that child going to die, but that man, that father who's carried the child is going to bring the infection back into his house. And we can relate to this now in new ways because of COVID. But when you don't have enough beds to isolate people and to keep them in quarantine and to treat them, it just means that it's just going to spread exponentially in these ways. And for him to tell that story just by video conference, for him to offer this first person testimonial, for Nadia to tell the story of what it meant for ISIS to come to her village, for her and her family. I mean, let me get out of the way, right? And I think too often, especially if you represent a powerful country, you think you have to mediate everything, but the greatest power, I think, is in those voices. And so I think to use what influence we have to create those platforms, that's how I think you can really create those human connections where how can you, and Russia might be saying, oh, that's fake news, or that's this or that. Then you have the doctor who's actually cared for chemical weapon survivors. I mean, you're going to say to the doctor that it's fake news when he's choked up describing what it was like to hold a child who'd been gassed by the Assad regime. So it can be very, very powerful, but you'd be surprised at how rarely it's done, or how people think, I'm going to tell a story now, but it's a kind of recycled story, or it's even in meeting new people, when someone is telling a story and it's coming from someplace deep within them versus, okay, this is story 16b, like, it's just different. And I think people know the difference. We know the difference, right? So why do we expect other people are going to think that recycled stories are compelling?
I want to be vulnerable and try not to humble brag at the same time. But in a world, the best that I can relate to your world is I had the good fortune of being a guest at the State Department one time to Jamaica, and it was in connection. There's a trying to stimulate the economy there, and there was a center for entrepreneurship Branson had started, and I was prepared to go there to tell stories of entrepreneurship and thought that was my job as a representative of the United States to go and to inspire and to tell stories and to, well, humble pie, like my stories were nothing compared to the stories that I ended up being able to bring back about to share with
Right.
people that were in my community about you've got it hard, raising money, getting your startup off the ground, launching your photography business.
Resilience, right? You're like preaching, oh, let me talk to you in Jamaica about resilience. And they're like, let me
It
talk to
it
you.
was
Yeah,
it was the most it was an amazing piece of humble pie, and I can only imagine how much that affects you to be the sort of the arbiter or that you're carrying these stories back to the people who are in a position to help or affect change. It just feels like a tremendous sense of responsibility. And so, as you know, that's my one little State Department story, but to
that's great. It's
connect it back
perfect.
to what
Yeah.
but what is your like that job that you have seems so huge. And so this is a thank you. Appreciate you for doing that on a daily basis. And I want to fast forward if we can, because you've hinted at it a couple times, and I want to sort of crescendo our conversation today with as much as we can talk about the what appears to be an opportunity at a next chapter for you, having been a journalist who in many ways was critical of U.S. foreign policy, and then you end up being in a position to make and shape and construct and be the an usher, if you will, in President Obama's cabinet. And can you share with us sort of the recent news that you're looking at in the next chapter?
Yes, I mean, thrillingly, dauntingly, President Biden has asked me to be the administrator of USAID, which is the world's largest development agency. So it has responsibility for example, the public health, US support for public health responses in developing countries to the COVID crisis. Now that economic gains in so many countries have been set back, maybe 2 decades because of COVID, helping think through what are the jobs programs, how can we work together to spur economic growth in these places. It's the agency that contributes vast resources to dealing with humanitarian emergencies like that in Ethiopia or Syria or Yemen or Venezuela, just to take a few examples. It should be the agency, and I think is hopefully, if I'm lucky enough to get into the job, I have to be confirmed by the Senate first, but it should play a major role in working with our partners to build resilience to climate shocks, which of course are going to be so much more prevalent in the coming years. And we know, for example, what California has dealt with in terms of forest fires. We know about flooding in Houston and Miami and everywhere. We know what farmers are going through in our country in terms of droughts because of climate change. Imagine all of that on top of not having even basic health infrastructure, as many poor countries lack, or if they had it now, it's been shattered by what's happened over the course of the pandemic. So the last thing I'd say about it, which sort of grafts more onto my background in human rights, is there every year is a little bit less freedom in the world, and we're seeing a lot of democratic backsliding. We're most familiar with our own, right, attacks on the media and questions about the legitimacy of opposition politics and conspiracy theories and misinformation and how that can fuel even extremism and violence. That's happening in many, many parts of the world. And so, working with the rest of the Biden administration to think through what's our answer, particularly when China is very ambitious, opening its checkbook and providing tech surveillance tools that allow governments to be more repressive. What's our answer to the decline in human rights enjoyment around the world, well and apart from the humanitarian and the development needs. Fundamentally, if you can't hold your government accountable, it's hard to get the economic pieces right, right? And it's hard to deal with corruption and often what inhibits development. So it's a big team. It's about 10,000 people. So there'll be many more management and leadership challenges and opportunities than I've dealt with before. So this conversation is actually really useful, right? Because you do learn that given how busy one gets and how scarce bandwidth becomes so quickly, whatever your job is, that it's the period before you leap, where you kind of develop that intentionality and really think through, how you're going to get the most out of learning from the team of amazing civil servants and foreign service officers who've been there for years, who have so much to learn from. And then to bring also, though, an outsider's perspective about what this moment of interlocking crises demands from us. And part of it will be, selling it to the private sector and entrepreneurs, selling it to the American people. And selling kind of sounds a little bit crude, but just enlisting and recognizing that given things weren't great before because of climate change and some structural issues with the economy, but given what COVID and the economic fallout from COVID have done, this is not going to be one government agency or 20 government agencies. It's going to be all hands on deck if we're going to crack the code here and get people back on their feet and self-reliant, which is what all of us want. We want it for ourselves and our families, and so nobody wants USAID assistance per se. What they want is the ability to have agency over their own lives and to be able to enjoy basic rights and justice. So I maybe get to be a part of that, and it's I think I use the term when in some of my prior work, bystander. Like sometimes in the last 4 years, as I've noted, I have felt like there are these displacement crisis, the climate crisis, the democracy crisis, the racial injustice crisis, so many things, and to have the opportunity potentially to harness more than just my own thoughts and to work with the team at USAID, but the broader team of public servants who've gone back in, and to find ways to even, again, broaden the conception of who the team is, to bring in outside actors and citizens and so forth. It feels like the right time to salute and show up and serve. And I just feel really lucky that I got the call.
Your speaking of getting the call, I love how in your book you opened up with being in a crowded cafe and receiving a call from then President Obama. That's a lovely story. There's both the actual call and then there's the metaphorical call.
Yeah.
And you're a fantastic storyteller. And again, I'd encourage folks to pick up the paperback. Comes out. I think it's right about when we're trying to drop this, The Education of an Idealist, a memoir. And I will say my just there is a thread of just something that's as big as government, even or as big as a company, an Apple or a Google, or it's just, how do you trust something that is so sort of big and I think it's fair there's a disconnect between the individual and this sort of trust. And talking to you, reading your book, I confess I also have had the opportunity on a few occasions to be a guest to the White House, and so many of the smartest, most articulate, heartfelt, earnest people have been in these roles that are as civil servants, and just that part gives me so much hope. And when you think of government with a capital G, and here I am standing on my fuzzy rug in front of a computer screen in Seattle, it's just it's hard to capture that. But thank you for providing a humane, real, heartfelt, earnest look into the people that are working on our behalf on the biggest, most challenging problems of our times. And so to that end, and to the point of your humanity, historically, I wouldn't ask this question because If it's about your motherhood, and um, if you were, and one of the reasons I wouldn't ask this is because if you were a male, I think it's historically that wouldn't be like, how was fatherhood in your, and so I wouldn't historically go here, but I was drawn to a piece in the Atlantic where you spoke so overtly about your motherhood and the role it played in shaping, and just um, the value that it brought to the lens that you have on your job and your life. And I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit about the role that your motherhood has played in this
My
process.
my motherhood is has has come back into play. No, no, no. I'm in an interview, love. But I'll come find you. That's what motherhood looks
I, I
like.
pr- Excellent. I love it. Very, very well timed. It's the timing there is
The fact that
impeccable.
we've
I
avoided
realize
it
we've
as long as a modern miracle. But so what I would say is that um, I think hopefully just by virtue of the experiences out in the world, before I got to these big institutions, I was able to identify. I hope I was able to identify, for example, with the people I was interviewing in Bosnia back in the day or in Darfur. Um, but to the degree that there were any limits to my imagination, I do think being a mother of two um, young kids, now 11 and 8, but when I was in my prior job, they were much, much younger. I had both of them while I was working at the White House in Obama's first term. But it does make you just say to yourself, gosh, what would it be like to not be able to, and then fill in the blank, right? To not be able to assure your child at night that they were going to make it through the night, given chemical weapons attacks, or to not be able to tell them that they would have um, a meal the next day. And I don't mean to be melodramatic about it, but it gets to the point that we've made a couple times about just feeling privileged and lucky and knowing how blessed I am. I think it's very motivating, right, to have kids and to just that the duty of care that we feel, and that we feel so privileged to be able to deliver on when we can, but to just imagine what it would be like to feel all that same love and then not be able to provide the kind of security across the board that kids. I mean, when you have kids, that's the word, whether it means a blankie or a teddy or just when are you coming home, mom. Security broadly defined is what they long for, and so I think it in that sense, being able to be in a position to enhance that, potentially, drawing on the pool of incredibly talented people already doing the work in the US government, in the UN and beyond. But personally, it's also, as I grappled with, and you asked the question gently, but it has been this question of going into a big job like this requires being less of a little league coach, and less of a soccer coach for my daughter, and that's a loss for them, and it's a big loss for me. At the same time, to be able to come home at night and say, this is what we're doing on climate change. This is actually what we're doing. Is it enough? No. Is it going to stop the kinds of things that you're seeing, and is it going to address the plight of the polar bear, which my daughter asks me about once a week? No, it's not in the short term, but to have an answer, and to be able to say, this is how I spent my day on the things that are going to matter most for you and your generation and your kids and grandkids, as well as for those people who live far away. So that's how I've thought about going back in, is bringing them into the conversation, hoping to make them feel like they're part of this team effort, this all hands on deck effort, because they're the ones who sacrifice in a way more than I will. And if I could just maybe end with something you said about the flesh and blood, like who government officials actually are. I mean, this was one reason, I was you in the sense, and I was maybe many of your listeners, where I was the outsider who went in, and then you've described like having various guests on who've been in public service in different ways. I had done that interviewing from the outside, some of it, but going in and looking around and saying, this isn't what people think government is, right? This isn't,
No.
it doesn't, it like, even in the movies, right? Maybe West Wing gave you some romantic sense of it, but just the sort of, it's not that the outcomes are always great or that the judgments are even always great, but the sort of integrity of purpose and the level of expertise, whether at the Environmental Protection
Yeah.
Agency or at the Defense Department or at the language expertise that I drew on when I was UN ambassador. So I thought, if we can, but also the humor, the black humor sometimes, but the that sense of exhilaration that can come when you feel that people are kind of rowing in the same direction, or that you are making the difference that you've sought, at least a fraction of the difference that you sought to make. I mean, it's not what people think about. And to be honest, now we have to rebuild a lot of these institutions because there's been a lot of attrition. There are major kind of morale issues, and we need to draw from untraditional pools of people. We need to recruit to come into government, whether in political appointments or in civil service appointments. People are going to actually shift from having maybe invented something out there to being willing to bring that entrepreneurial and creative spirit, into bureaucracies. Like, who wants to join a bureaucracy? Well, I think that actually bureaucracy isn't what it's reputed to be. I mean, at least again, if you have the kind of leadership that wants to harness the talents of the individuals within it, which I think we really do going forward. And so it's almost a plug, for people who've always thought that creation has to come outside large institutions, but that I've just seen firsthand that when you marry that outsider perspective with some of that expertise and experience that has lived within these institutions, like, pretty electric and very much impactful things can happen. So I just hope we can bring more people into the fold and demystify a little bit what it is that goes on there.
Yeah, the my time in Jamaica under the ambassador Luis Morena, I got to speak at length with him, and he was one of the people who was on his way out because he couldn't stomach the experience that was happening within the department and our need to sort of refuel across so many different
But differently,
areas
as,
of the.
as Biden says, build back better, right? So it's like,
Mhm.
had we just kept going, we would have been tweaking here and incremental this and that. And now there is an opportunity to just really broaden the conversation of who belongs and of what the identity of these institutions is. I mean, it's like many crises, right? We find opportunity in it, but there's a big one here.
I'm like, I grew up taking pictures of me and my friends skateboarding. Why am I in the what am I doing in the White House here? But that's that inclusive. That's part of the story that I was hoping would come out of our conversation today. And thank you so much for sharing so many insights. Your journey from as you said, the Irish pub to the halls of to journalism, to the halls of government, and now in the role that you're excitedly stepping into. I wish you all of the best. Thank you for your storytelling, your heartfelt, your humanity, and helping us see that this is something that we can believe in, and how you use your creativity, your entrepreneurial spirit, your belief in yourself and others. So thank you for being on the show. Super, super grateful. And if there's anything I can ever do to help, just I'm a text away. Thank you so much for being on the show. Anything else I can do? Do you want to sign off? What's the best place in addition to just buying the book, because it is truly fantastic, and it really is. And I'm not trying to suck up here, but The Education of an Idealist, a memoir. Again, Ambassador Samantha Power. Anything, where can people find you if they want to, what's the best place in addition to buying the book, if they want to know more or follow along with your
I'm
life?
on Twitter. I'm more of a tweeter than a Facebooker. And So Twitter will all have government accounts soon, but I have a personal account there where I sound off on various issues, and I have a website but that's more for when I'm out of government and touring and speaking and engaging young people again. I can't wait to do that, and I hope to do more of it from aid. So I don't know. You can also follow when I'm confirmed. You can take nothing for granted in this political environment, Chase. So we can't get ahead of ourselves. But if in fact I get to become a USAID administrator, follow the agency. It's doing such amazing work around the world.
Thank you. There's so many people interested in social justice, in climate change, in so many of the issues that you've spoken about today. Thank you and Godspeed. All the best, and
Thank you, Chase.
grateful for your time today. Thanks so
And
much.
yours. Thank you so much. Thanks, everybody. Thank you.